I had an early midlife crisis. I ended up at a work event rearranging the downstairs of a restaurant in a way that the interior designers probably didn't approve of. And I remember sitting on a bench outside a church thinking, that's it, man, I've ruined my life. Kevin dropped me with a body shot after about a minute or two. And the odd thing about me is I sort of didn't mind. If you want to succeed, you've got to double your failure rate.
2, 1, rolling.
This is StoryCo, the podcast about the business of story and storytelling. I'm James Kirkham. Let's get into it. Alex Wade is a lawyer, a writer, and a surfer. In that order of discovery, maybe the reverse order of importance. He spent his career doing what very few people manage, operating in completely different worlds simultaneously and letting each one make the other sharper. He knows how institutions work, how language gets used to obscure the truth, and how to find the line that perfectly balances risk with journalistic truth. In the water and on the page, the question is the same. How long can you hold your nerve before you pull back? Alex Wade, welcome to the show. We tend to start this show with 4 simple words. Tell me a story.
Thank you, James. Thank you for having me. I think my story, a story about the value of being risk-friendly and of embracing change. I've been quite a few things in my life. It's not been a static life. It's not been a very linear life. But all the way through, as a person, I think I've always been quite happy to take risks. I believe in embracing change, doing new things generally. I think that's an inclusive way of living one's life. So as a skater, I knew a guy called Steph Harkin, who was one of the UK's first professional skateboarders. Wow. And Steph is probably 62, 63 now. Now, in recent years, I lived in Cornwall, knew Steph. He's a very good surfer, but Steph still skates. And down at the bowl in Hale, there is an overhang lip, and Steph is the only guy there in his late 50s at that time who was frontside grinding that overhang. Now, that's technical skate talk, but what that basically means is all the teens looking at him can't do that. None of them have got any idea how to do it, and they're just in awe. And I love the fact that Steph, late in his 50s, and probably to this, I haven't seen him for a while, but I bet you he's still doing that now. And that is a little simple story. I love that.
I think that's absolutely wonderful. Because as you say, your route is perhaps not linear. You're sitting here today, and we're going to get on to this, but you're in charge of what is ultimately a super smart, tech-orientated startup predicated on AI. But, correct me if I'm wrong, you've come to this through journalism, writing, you've been an author, you've wrote about boxing, you've written for The Times, The Guardian, some of the biggest newspapers, broadsheets on the planet. So give us a bit of that colour. How on earth did we get to here?
To anybody who knows me well, the idea that I am presiding over an AI-powered tech business is absolutely about as surreal as it gets, because tech was never my middle name at all. I still have trouble turning the remote over on the TV to find the football, you know. But yeah, I am now the co-CEO of a business called ClearDraft, which is an AI-powered legal clearance business, and it's pretty radical, what we've created. But back in the early days, I've a vintage now where this sort of thing was pretty much unimaginable. But no, I did an English degree, wanted to just go off and write. I wanted to write that great novel, all that kind of stuff, the classic writerly impulse and journey, which usually achieves very little. I'd always been really into sport as well of one kind or another. And I went to Australia for a year out to go surfing. I was really into surfing, windsurfing, skateboarding, all those things. Came back, I thought, I'll just get a job as a journalist now for The Guardian or someone like that. I failed to get anywhere. I went about it in a completely cack-handed, rubbish way. My father was a lawyer, my brother was a lawyer, and I'd racked up some debt by then. And I thought, well, I've got to pay the debts off somehow or other. And I very much targeted doing the kind of law that uses words, i.e. defamation law. So the meaning of text was always what fascinated me. But it was, I guess it was a bit inadvertent, because at the same time I had written a novel. I wrote it while I was doing my law conversion course. I racked up about 50 rejection slips, and one of them was very memorable in that it said something like, "Thank you for sending us your novel. Having read it, I would be amazed if anyone, anywhere, ever published this work."
Oh, my God.
And, quite brutal. Another agency lost the manuscript at the time, and they probably quite rightly lost it. It was probably terrible. So really, writing wasn't going anywhere. So it was plunge into the law and make the best of it.
There's quite a lot there already, which I'd love to get into, but there's a certain adversity. I mean, I'm slightly obsessed these days about the importance of rejection, full stop. I'm not sure it happens perhaps enough in all walks of life. We live so much behind screens, and I certainly think for younger people, there's an important learning there. Getting over those, like, did they affect you? I mean, that's a brutal reply to get too, by the way, but did it affect you, or were you still committed to kind of achieving your dream?
I think there's no question that it affected me. And later, about 10 years after that, my first book was published by Simon & Schuster. It felt amazing. I'm through the door. The first review completely disabused me of that notion. It was, we'll probably come on to it, but the book was about boxing and how I got into it. And I'd got involved in this thing called The Real Fight Club, and it traded off the film Fight Club to a degree. And I think the review began with, everybody will remember in Fight Club, the first rule of Fight Club is don't talk about Fight Club. If only Alex Word had remembered that and not written this book, something like that. So, but to your point,
God, these are brutal.
Oh yeah, they absolutely are. And so the rejection when amazed if anybody anywhere will ever publish this. Yeah, it felt really awful. That review in Metro, I just felt like I literally felt, having got into boxing a lot at that stage, as if I just had a body shot. It really was painful. However, what I think has happened again in my life is that old phrase, if you want to succeed, you've got to double your failure rate. I think actually ultimately, I personally, not everyone's wired like this, I think if you can channel that rejection into some sense of purpose and you're going to literally show them they're wrong, that can be useful. I don't know if I've actually successfully done that.
I couldn't agree with you more. Who taught you that?
No one. I mean, that's just kind of how I've approached life, I think.
And is it too simplistic of me to compare that to, you've already mentioned boxing, but is there something there? Is it very obvious that you were going to write and act within a boxing space, for example?
Again, as I said, all I'd ever really wanted to do, football aside, was write. So I think I knew I'd get there somehow or other. Boxing came later in my life, and I plunged into it. I had a couple of fights at York Hall. So
for international, global audience that this pod is, tell us a bit about York Hall. So, it's just up the road from where we're filming today, literally.
Well, York Hall is one of British boxing's most iconic venues, possibly its most iconic venue, in fact.
And explain a little also to the audience, if you may, about white-collar boxing and that whole... Because this is proper spit and sawdust territory, isn't it?
Yeah, so white-collar boxing began about 20-odd years ago. It started in New York. And it was a very subterranean thing back in the day as I was getting into it. And it really was city blokes turning up in boxing gyms and knocking seven bells out of each other. A chap called Alan Lacey, an events promoter and former boxer himself, set up an organisation called the Real Fight Club. He knew there was something in this, and he basically sort of codified it. So he made sure that white-collar boxers would fight to the Queensberry rules, 3 2-minute amateur rounds, supervised, properly refereed with ambulance people, all the usual rigmarole. I think the Amateur Boxing Association at the time weren't very keen on it because they felt it was unlicensed, it was exploiting some loophole, and possibly it was. But at the end of the day, Alan and others who then came in his wake did do it all properly. So there was proper medical care. People were properly matched. Having said that, my first fight was against a chap called Vince Dynamite Dixon. And when I weighed in against Vince and I looked at him on the scales, very heavily tattooed bloke, looked very formidable.
So come on, what does that feel like? Because I've never seen Vince Dynamite Dixon, but I'm pretty sure I don't want to fight him.
I don't think most people do, no.
What is that? And I've also done a tiny bit, I mean, who hasn't done a tiny bit of boxing, but the notion of getting in with someone who really knows what they're doing, it's a scary proposition, especially when it's a very animalistic, baying crowd around. What's that moment feel like?
Well, I think Barry McGuigan summed it up beautifully and perfectly, which is in boxing, you're not driven by fear of pain, you're driven by fear of humiliation. So when I was weighing in with Vince, I'm looking at the guy thinking, this bloke is going to eat me alive. I've got one aim. I'm thinking, if I get knocked out within the first 10 seconds with all my mates who turned up, that's going to be, I just can't have that happen.
Interesting.
So I've got to survive. I've got to tuck up and move around properly and not let Vince destroy me. Later I was training in a gym in Islington and someone said to me, you did all right against Vince. And do you know who he is? And I said, no, well, I was told he was a novice. And no, he's a regional champion. Anyway, so it was a tough fight.
That's kind of wonderful. I also love the phrase tuck up and move around properly. And I know you mean that entirely from a boxing capacity, but I'm sorry, but there are very obvious work connotations and analogies there that I can't help but draw out. And just coming back and touch more on that, you immediately referenced this world. You mentioned like city boys coming there, loosening the ties. What's all that about? Was that catharsis, escapism? Was that Was that about their antidote to their life behind screens and terminals? Was that a machismo? What is that? Why that genre and industry specifically?
There's an awful lot there to unpack. I think it is a very heavy macho environment, the city. I think a lot of people wanted to, simple things like relieve a bit of stress. But I, having spent years in boxing gyms, and I still train now, still keep fit, I wouldn't spar now at all, I'm far too old. But I came to believe that you end up in boxing for one of two reasons. One is your dad takes you down there at an early age and you just become used to it and it becomes second nature. Secondly, you might be taken there because of some level of trauma or psychological difficulty that you're trying to work out. You might not even know what that is either. And that was probably more the case for me at that juncture in my life. There were things I was angry with myself about, and I wanted to get in a boxing gym, and I didn't really mind getting pulverised, to be frank.
Well, also, when you very first get, the fear of getting hit is almost worse than the first time you get hit, because the first time you get hit, in a strange way, it doesn't hurt as much as your fear of it. Would you agree?
I would. And, the first time I trained, I used to train a lot at a very, very good amateur boxing club in Swindon called Walcott Amateur Boxing Club. Legendary coach, sadly departed recently, Harry Scott, whose obituary I wrote for the Times. It's a great privilege for me. But, when you close the doors of that gym, it was a real sawdust environment. It was Harry's rules, very, very hard, very disciplined. And the first time I went down there, I persuaded a friend of mine to come down with me, Andy. And we got told to glove up and spar. None of us had ever done it. Neither of us had done any boxing whatsoever. And I got in the ring with a bloke called Kevin, who was a very, very good boxer, did a lot of unlicensed stuff, I think, allegedly, possibly. Anyway, Kevin dropped me with a body shot after about a minute or two. And the odd thing about me is I sort of didn't mind. But I think Andy, it's fair to say, took one look at all that and then took his gloves off and declined to get in the ring. And that's a perfectly rational, sensible decision.
Sensible,
really is.
Sensible is probably the operative word there.
Yeah.
When I was first introduced by a good friend of mine, Scott, to Muay Thai, Thai boxing, he'd written an article for it. He'd been a journalist too. And he said, just come down. And it was this, it was Miami Gym on the Old Kent Road. And I caught the bus there. And I was in my 20s. At first, though, I was like, you're mad. Look at me. I'm a shambolic physical wreck. I go out drinking all the time. I work incredibly hard. The idea that I can go there and at all be of any sort of level. I mean, I was right on most of those counts. The bit that surprised me most, these were some of the hardest people I'd ever come across in my life, but the sheer gang mentality. They were also some of the nicest and most altruistic. They looked out for you almost immediately, in a way that no other gym environment did, be it as in a normal, regular kind of gym. I found that almost natural, instant camaraderie something incredibly infectious, actually, that still stands today, I think.
Well, I think I would endorse that experience of yours because, and I think in another world I found that, which was skateboarding. I was a massive skater in my teens and 20s.
Great.
And I wonder if one thing unites those two things, because in boxing there is huge camaraderie, but both things hurt an awful lot. You take a slam when you're dropping in on a bowl, or and it goes wrong. I've dislocated this right shoulder of mine 6 times skateboarding before I finally thought, you know what, maybe I should stop skateboarding, because I just slam and it would come out. But I think that the camaraderie you therefore foster, because everyone around you doing it knows the consequences of this going wrong are severe. You're going to hurt yourself badly. So it fosters a kind of, we're all in this together.
See, I love that. I've never really thought that. And I think it's so commonly kind of recognised where people talk about extreme sports and adrenaline junkies and the addiction to that, basically, body chemical. But that's something different what you're describing, because that's something that then you as people share a commonality, dare I say, stories about. We all have our stories of that time you were hit or dropped or hit the canvas or injured during or from that half pipe that went wrong. Yeah. Do you think story is a part of that? The fact that it brings us together with like-minded souls in a way that feels familiar.
What I love about the story is obviously something very dear to my heart. But I mean, listen, you can sure get quite a few anecdotes out of if you engage in these things.
Just carrying on this journey, this irregular, non-linear career journey. Tell us a little bit more about the legal profession, because as I understand it, as a young man, still in your 20s, you were legal counselling the likes of Richard Desmond. Tell us about what chaos that must have been.
So I was at Carteret and there for 4 years, and I went and I became Richard Desmond's head of legal affairs.
And again, Richard Desmond, for those who don't know.
Well, he ultimately became the owner of the Express Group, newspaper group. But back then, he published OK magazine, Arsenal Football Club's magazine. But he was also well known for one or two top shelf magazines, and as the first person to bring soft porn to UK screens.
But the wider world of working for someone like Richard, who is ultimately a media mogul, proprietor, hugely successful, hugely influential, let's be honest, certainly in British culture. Tell us a bit more about that. Was that crazy times? Was it frankly easy? Give us a bit of a perspective on that.
I think when you work for Richard, at the time I was obviously very young and probably in a position that I got when I probably shouldn't have had it really. Head of legal affairs generally is in your mid to late 30s, if not older. It was interesting. It was exciting. Richard, again, keeping within all due libel laws, is a very charismatic man. I wouldn't say he's the easiest guy to work for.
Yeah.
But what I've also learned as life's gone on, it felt at times like you've never met a one-off like Richard. But actually, there are quite a few people like him.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Back then for Richard, we had some very interesting big syndication deals, et cetera, et cetera. It was very high pressure. You are making calls, and at that point in your career, because I also used to moonlight as what's called a night lawyer for the Mirror at the time as well.
And what's a night lawyer?
You rock up at the national newspapers at around about 4 or 5 in the afternoon. The in-house lawyers usually finish about 6 o'clock. And you then stay until about 10, 11 o'clock at night, and you see the paper off stone, as it quaintly used to be known. So you're the one who's responsible for sorting out all the legal issues for next day's paper. The in-house team will have resolved quite a few of them, but you're the one who sees the thing to bed, basically. And back then, you'd go home and you'd fret. You wouldn't sleep because you'd think, have I made the right call?
Did it take a toll, that environment? I think many people might have a view on what that culture was like, that kind of Fleet Street heyday, kind of everybody chain smoking, drinking whiskey at the table, but probably a very fun environment. Would that be true? Or
do you know what? Yes, I'd agree with that. So chronologically, I was with Richard for a while. Then I sort of moved out because, to go to your point, it was very high octane, and I could see, I felt things were going to go awry for me if I hung around.
Did you know? You knew that about yourself? You sensed
I think
that?
so. There was, I was young.
Because often people don't; they miss it.
But I was afraid that, frankly, I was going to go off the rails because I was young and being asked out for dinner all the time. You're in a quite a highly charged environment. I mean, for one, the night that the Labour Party got in under Tony Blair, the Fantasy Channel decided to broadcast a live show that night called the General Erection Night. And I was the lawyer in the gallery in charge of trying to ask a collection of adult performers and stars to behave themselves and comply with prevailing independent television guidelines at the time, now Ofcom.
So did you take yourself out of such an environment? Did you decide?
I took a job with a law firm called Wigan, which is an excellent law firm. I think the issues that then led me to boxing also meant that I went off the rails. I had an early midlife crisis and behaved poorly. I ended up at a work event rearranging the downstairs of a restaurant in a way that the interior designers probably didn't approve of. In fact, I don't think anybody approved of, probably not even me. And I was duly asked to leave the day after, and absolutely rightly. It was entirely my own fault. It was the author of all the misfortune that landed on my head was my own fault. But you know what? It was funny looking at that. This is all ancient history now, but that moment felt so bleak at the time.
Sure.
And I remember sitting outside on a bench outside a church thinking, that's it, man. I've ruined my life. I've absolutely ruined my life. As a lawyer, I will never recover from this. What am I going to do? I'm a failed writer. I've achieved nothing. But it was the making of me. It was absolutely fantastic for me. Now, I wouldn't recommend it as a career path. I really wouldn't. For me, it was ultimately a blessing in disguise.
And how long did it take you to realise that there was a blessing hidden in that moment? Because you said you were sort of aware perhaps that kind of thing was brewing because of the nature of the environment you were in, which is very common in, as you say, high octane, highly pressured environments. It happens a lot in the music industry for many decades, for example, and all sorts of others. But in other words, how hard did that hit you, and how long did it take before realising that actually there's a path out of this?
Well, you know what, James? I think back then I had 2 small children. And so the absolute priority for me was to make sure I could get some cash in and pay the mortgage next month. So I really didn't have time to think. And in some ways, I regret the absence of thought because I think it's come to me more later in life. But really my priority, the day after I was thrown out, I was, right, what am I going to do? Where am I going to get some work?
Day after.
I literally spent one day, and for me, it's very unusual to be like this. I was catatonic. I couldn't really speak. I was just like, could not believe what I had managed, the self-destructiveness of my actions. But on the second day, I was right. Who can give me work? Where can I get some work? And a couple of people who I will always thank. You know, I got work on the night rotas of The Independent and The Sun, thanks to lawyers I knew. I then got a job somewhere else with a very good law firm. And I think they all took the view that, well, look, Alex, we know you've got personal problems, but you're a good lawyer, so just keep your head down, don't mess up. And that was, I'm forever indebted to them in having taken a chance on me to get my feet back on the ladder and get back into the law.
But I think a lot of people would also say that's probably down to a quality within your own mindset. Clearly necessity, as you said, 2 young kids often are a fabulous driver and immediate ground. And it's not like you're going to do months of navel gazing because there's no opportunity to, that I suspect is a brilliant thing in a moment like that. But likewise, what about the writing as a creative outlet? Was that a good thing? Were you doing that as well concurrently? Was boxing a wonderful sort of mental help, as it often is? Were these things present in your life at that time?
Yes, they were. Now, at the time that everything was going absolutely terribly wrong, I was working on another novel.
And which one was this?
This was not, it's not published. It's, again, lurking in a bottom drawer somewhere. It sounds desperately pretentious. It was like a literary meditation on the nature of love. And I sent it off to a couple of editors, and I actually got some very good feedback. I didn't get the no one will ever publish this. And then I got an agent through it as well who read it and said, look, you write some nice sentences, let's meet. At this same point in time, I'd got into boxing. So it was he who said, look, if you publish this now, if I try and get you a deal, it's just going to sink because you've come from nowhere. But actually, the fact that you've ended up getting into boxing after this disaster in your life, finding order in the chaos of it, it's quite an interesting narrative. So that's the route the writing took then.
And did the writing flow naturally? Are they moments of inspiration that just come to you in a kind of, in that almost cliche light bulb flash, wake up in the middle of the night? Or, you wrote very much, didn't you, about the death of Fleet Street? Were they just moments in time that you felt compelled to write about? What caused you to put pen to paper at those times?
It's a good question. And having got back in the law after the disaster, I then voluntarily this time exited the law in order to write. And I ended up becoming a journalist for all of the broadsheets and wrote some more books. I think actually if you work as a professional writer, the idea of the sitting there with your gauloir in your attic and reading a bit of Coleridge perhaps, and then suddenly inspiration strikes.
Not the case.
You're never going to make a living like that.
Sounds great.
Might have fun, but so you need to be much, much more disciplined. So, and I think each time I've written a book, there's been a clear idea, and I've been lucky enough that I've got to deal with a publishing house, and then there is a deadline. They want the manuscript by X date, so you've got to deliver. And that discipline as a freelance journalist as well. If someone says, I want 1,500 words on this by then, you deliver 1,500 words at that deadline.
Some say difficulty of freelance journalism and probably deadlines piling up and the restraint and constraint on those timings is kind of a good thing when it comes to the freeform writing, the creativity, you think. Like from those constraints, do you write better even?
I absolutely subscribe to that. I really do. And I've gave a few lectures on professional writing courses, and I used to say to people there, all of you should learn to write 400 words to order within half an hour.
That's interesting.
About any subject, this jug on this table, give me 400 words on that. And be able to do it at a drop of a hat, because that's going to inform your ability to write your 80,000 word novel or non-fiction book, whatever it is.
What is it then about the creation of an intense environment, albeit manufactured and something where there's no actual danger? What is it about that then that squeezes out creativity, do we think?
Because that stultifying environment, there's a narrative there in its own right.
That's interesting.
And certainly in my first book, there's one chapter of the extraordinarily stultifying environment I found myself in when I got back into the law, of just process-driven legal work, black letter law as they call it, amending contract after contract after contract with no sense of flexibility or fluidity or what's the human part of this at all? It was just a process. But to strip away and look at it, narratively, that's fascinating. I mean, look at Melville and Bartleby the Scrivener, that wonderful short story, or rather long short story, where he sits there staring at a wall all day long. That's the premise of the story, in effect. But it's brilliant. Melville conjures all kinds of stuff out of it. So I'm not sure whether you agree, James, with the chap you just mentioned, but I don't think an ostensibly dry corporate environment is necessarily hostile to writing.
That's a really interesting thought. Likewise, I'm just wondering where this sits today, and perhaps this is a nice segue into how you're currently seeing the world, the work that you're about to embark on, or rather are as we sit here talking today, that the business underpinned by ultimately the most seismic shift in technology arguably there's ever been in the human race with AI. Many people are seeing that as a worry. And before we start talking about how you're leveraging it for your own business, many people are seeing it as the end of all of the creativity that we've just described. The simplicity with which people can conjure up words and phraseology and sentences and filling the pipes with slop. And all of those are accusations. I draw comfort in how you've just described something and what you taught, though, in that surely there's a freeing aspect. Surely there's toil and drudgery and sifting through and research that means if this artificial intelligence can do this bit, then there's a whole part of us that should be freed and creativity can come out of it. Do you see it like that? Are you concerned? Is this a good thing?
Well, listen, I'm not going to sit here and tell you I'm opposed to AI. Of course I'm not. I think a lot of this comes down to human need. I think humans need to tell stories. I absolutely fundamentally believe that. I also fundamentally believe that we should be free to tell those stories. So my take on this, and I'll give you a quick example, but I think, and let's caveat it with, we're looking at the worst form of AI we're ever going to see at the moment. So I may be wrong. But recently, I have an 8-year-old daughter, and she and I were I was writing a poem, and she was doing the illustrations for it. And for about 3 or 4 nights in a row, I managed to hit that. Hey, I'm a good dad. I've managed to find the time to do this. On the 5th, she said, hey, Daddy, let's do the next verse. Have you written it? And I thought, oh, God, I haven't done it. So I put it into Le Chat, the French AI tool, and I said, here are the first 3 verses. Please complete this poem in the same whimsical fashion. Sure enough, it did it. Now, I went through to the living room and I said, hey, Maud, my daughter, here's the next verse. And she said, oh, great, Daddy, that's great. Now, I felt really awful, actually, because I felt like I'd taken a really shortcut and I'd let her down. But aside from my own moral guilt on that front, at the end of the day, do I want, as a writer, to rely on that? And it wasn't dare I say, as good as my wonderful poem itself. Do I want AI to be writing novels, making films, composing music? If you're a creator as well, James. Do you really want that to happen? And I don't think you do. So I think that what we're going to see is an adaptation as we all become used to it and we work out how it's going to be beneficial and helpful. I don't mean as a panacea for everything, because of course there will be areas where AI can do better and perhaps is unhelpful. But for us as creators, I think we're going to adapt to it and find that it doesn't replace that fundamental drive to tell stories, which is what we're talking about here.
I love that. I love the story of that with your daughter. I thought you were going to say she recognised that it wasn't one of your works.
She said, Daddy, that new verse is better than all you've done so far.
I was really hoping it was going to be the opposite. I mean, gosh, there's a lot to pick out on there, and it may be for another show. Maybe if you come back, we'll really dissect it further. But my perspective is we've just lived through an era that I think arguably might be more damaging. And what that is where the monetization of big tech that led to the flattening of culture and algorithmic tyranny and social feeds that led us to a different place. Now we're layering in AI and we're thinking, oh, it's only going to reinforce the problem. My hope is something different. We were kind of averaging it out for the many in trading it up for these things called likes and algorithmic satisfaction. And my hope is that we're all spending time with this thing that is engineered to know you even better than you know yourself, progressively enhancing what you're saying, thinking, doing, feeling, and writing. And our time with them might return us to an era of the new rock star editors, the new auteurs, the new superstar creators, the image of Picasso in his studio or Francis Bacon. I see a bit more of that because time will be spent sometimes alone, but with this thing allowing you to turn a whimsical thought or a book I once thought I might want to write or a side hustle into it and be able to extract that from you. That's sort of my hope.
Yeah, well, I wonder if we travel back in time to the invention of the printing press. You know, were there a bunch of scribblers with pen and ink at the time who mutinied and demoed?
I love that.
You've just destroyed our... We will never... No writing will ever happen again. So I just think that human beings adapt, and I think we're going to see another phase of adaptation.
This is probably a good time to talk about what it is that you're running. And you were very self-deprecating at the start of this conversation. You said many people would be surprised that you're effectively running a business now that's predicated on the hottest new technology on the planet, because you were never that guy. But it strikes me you are that guy because of the career trajectory we've just discussed. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing. What is it? What it's called? Where it's at?
Okay, so the business is called ClearDraft. We've been going about 3 or 4 months now. What we have built is an AI-powered legal clearance tool. So if you wanted to transcribe a script of our dialogue now and send it to me, and supposing we had made a whole lot of defamatory statements, or we'd infringed someone's privacy, or we'd even perpetrated contempt of court.
I think we did it a couple of times.
I think you better get a libel lawyer to look at this, okay? You would be able to run that script through our product, and in about 2 seconds max, you would have a legal report identifying all the issues and telling you what the available defences are. Gosh. And we're actually working on the latest iteration now, where we will also build in editorial amends. My co-CEO, David, has left Netflix to do this business with me. I've sold a law firm of which I was the owner and CEO in order to concentrate on this. We absolutely sort of put our money where our mouths are, thinking this is the future. We've David and I, a pair of us, we've come from those backgrounds of working with newspapers, broadcasters, streamers, etc., top publishing houses, etc., all that kind of thing. What we did to build it is we created a vast bank of fictional articles. We had a couple of paralegals help us, and then we legaled them. We overdid it. The
full red line treatment.
Yeah, red lines everywhere, because we had to teach the tech company with which we contracted in California, excellent business called Yeti. We had to give their engineers all the information they could need to create the prompts and build the algorithms that would effectively synthesize what we felt were our big, beautiful brains. In many ways, it was a bit of a challenge. Could they be replicated, or are we so clever? Actually, we're not so clever.
So they were your versions of an LLM, right? Your legal language model, but it was predicated on your legal knowledge. Would that be correct?
Well, again, the engineers don't like me talking about tech. So we're using at any one time...
I definitely shouldn't.
We're using the best available LLM.
Got it.
But what we built around it is a complex AI workflow, a series of prompts and something called RAG, Retrieval Augmented Generation. And that, to put it very, very simply, is effectively David and I's brains. We didn't ingest any third-party material to build this at all. We've got more than 60 years combined experience between us of making very difficult calls on very difficult material within, a 10-minute time frame, pretty much.
And so would it have to have been trained repeatedly on the brilliance of both your brains and the 60 years combined knowledge? Is that something that is still ongoing, for example, or is there almost a finite amount that you can input?
There will never be a finite amount, no. So to make sure that it remains as cutting edge as possible, we've hired some lawyers now, some excellent lawyers, Sarah and Natalie. We've got another chap joining us soon. They, like us, have had a lifetime in this space. To make sure that what we build is as good as it should be, it has to constantly train on new data, in effect. But we're not interested really on the pure copy, the script of our dialogue now. We're interested in the lawyer's marks on that dialogue. Every day there's a new thing.
And I guess there's almost trends is perhaps the wrong word, but I suspect seasons shifts in tone to what is right that is very human. So to your point, it has to continue to have that almost organic, evolving aspect to it, or it will become outdated because it just won't be applicable for whatever the now is.
Absolutely. You look at now in publishing and in film and TV, you'll be asked to address sensitivity issues. Now, what that means is 20, 30 years ago, a UK sitcom like, what's the Alf Garnett one? Anyway.
In Sickness and in Health.
Okay.
The thoroughly inappropriate, deeply racist sitcom from
exactly.
the 70s.
Now,
yeah,
back
80s.
then it was fine. It's definitely not fine. Do you know what? Actually, it wasn't fine back then. And it wasn't fine at all. And
But even 90s TV now, I've just watched the entire seasons of the likes of even Friends, which is wallpaper bubblegum telly, really.
Yeah.
My 16-year-olds just watch lots of it. Many a time he'd stop an episode and go, couldn't say that now.
Well, you look at...
But they recognise it, funnily enough.
Yes, absolutely.
but as in, it's funny that the 16-year-old mind immediately sees what it was then and what it was now. I don't see Friends as 30. Well, this is the terrible thing. I don't see it as long ago as it is. You assume it's just a pretty current, but...
I mean, what this goes to, of course, is an incredibly interesting time in the world, where on the one hand we have our friend, the orange person at the helm of the American government. On the other hand, you have people like Carol Cadwallader, who wrote a fantastic piece for The Nerve. I don't know if you've seen that yet.
I adore what she writes. I pore over it. It keeps me up at night. Phenomenal force of good, in my opinion.
She is. She's written a fantastic piece, you may have read it already, about what does the Epstein files, what do they really show us? Because at the moment, we're all aghast at the latest high-profile man, very wealthy man, who's caught up in Epstein's web. Well, actually, you know what? Is it that big a surprise? Because there's embedded misogyny in our culture. And Carol's written fantastically about it. So you can see that could well change. In 10 years' time, do we... Things that we might at the moment take for granted in publishing or broadcasting, maybe in 10 years' time won't be.
Even that example, I think, is a particularly pertinent one, because of where we're at with the news cycle and the news agenda. But the resurgence, the second term of Trump, wherever anyone sits geopolitically or whatever end of the spectrum, Piers Morgan's got a book out, I think, called The End of Woke Culture. In other words, there's been this shift even in 3 or 4 years that's gone from George Floyd and Me Too to apparently the end of woke culture, which is entirely a culture war seemingly created anyway. And the word woke has just been manufactured, full stop. But apparently that's gone. But already with the horrific revelations within the Epstein files, it's almost like, well, maybe we can reset just where this should all be framed. So I guess the point I'm reinforcing that you've made is that's in a couple of years. That's not decades. So to your point, this has to keep shifting and quite fast. Yeah,
quite often I find myself saying, well, just behave ethically. And people forget it all the time. And I haven't read Piers' book, and frankly, I'm not sure I would.
Same.
The end of woke culture? Well, maybe the end of woke PR. Maybe there's some change in the narrative. But if woke means behaving ethically and well, then we should all do that. And actually, many of us have done that. I mean, now, listen, I didn't tick that box too well in my early years. But in terms of should one go around being racist, sexist, et cetera, it was never right as a kid when I was growing up.
Yeah.
And it's even less right now, you know.
So if I'm a critic, on the one hand, wow, you've just described to me a technology and a platform that's eaten the lunch of the very business that gave you your whole career. Is that fair?
Well, it's a good question. And in one presentation, we were dubbed someone said to us, oh, hey, guys, you're the unemployment squad.
Thank you.
But we are not the unemployment squad. No, we're the efficiency squad. Because what we are doing, what we've built is something that will change things very significantly. If you're a major multinational media group, we've done a strategic alliance with one. We're working with one of Europe's top publishing houses already, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what we're bringing to them is, no, not the end of lawyers' jobs. We're freeing those lawyers up to go through the Epstein files, to trawl through if Carol or another journalist has put a name in of a particular character because they have got some insight into them and they're thinking, you know, that massive trove of documents, what's that name going to reveal? Then they find it. Those in-house lawyers should have their time freed up to concentrate on that, work with journalists to get to the bottom of that, not have to churn through what is a lot of everyday stuff quite often in the publishing environment.
So I was making a reference earlier where I was talking about sort of giving you the freedom and the space, frankly, to be creative, but arguably more importantly, the way you've just described that, that's a huge important thing. If we're trawling through 3 million files or whatever the number is at the moment, it's overwhelming. It's oversaturation in every possible way.
Yeah.
Culture can't absorb it enough, whether it be critiqued or analysed, whether it be cultural commentators, broadcasters, the media, individuals. It's an almost impossible task. So the flooding of the zone is natural, which is, what many people kind of wanted anyway, but it's almost impossible. So the idea that the tool that you're presiding over now it's not about, oh, hey, we're freeing them, giving people a bit more time back. It's a really important thing that you're going to be doing then as a service. It's kind of vital when you describe it as such.
Well, also, you've got to remember, James, and I don't want to worry you because I'm not sure where you publish your material.
Oh, don't do this.
Listen, nine times out of 10...
Fortunately, I've not got enough subscribers.
9 times out of 10, nothing will go wrong. That's the reality. But the problem with defamation and these things, if they go wrong, they go really badly wrong. And the way our legal system works in the UK is if you did publish something defamatory and indefensible and someone did sue you, you're liable for not just your own legal costs. You've got to go and pay a lawyer to help you out. If you lose, you've got to pay the other side's costs as well.
But even when you say, and I can't believe I'm asking such a naive question on a podcast that the world can listen to, maybe we'll cut this. But when you say publish, do you mean a Substack?
Yeah.
Do you?
Yes. The moment you publish in law to one single other person, you are liable in law for the tort of defamation.
Wow.
So if you've, I'm sure your Substack's got more than a couple of subscribers, James. I'm sure it's pretty healthy. And so you're publishing to a great many people, and as are other Substack creators elsewhere. We live in the era where everyone is a creator now.
Absolutely.
And the thing that worries me as a libel lawyer stroke writer, my dual identity is, because as a writer, I can forget the libel law quite easily, like the best of them. But this can be bankruptcy-inducing stuff if you get it wrong, Many a writer has come up against the libel laws and had books pulped, injuncted back in the day, and or had to sell a house because how am I going to pay the legal fees? But listen, most of the time it's fine. It really is. But it's just when it goes wrong, it can be really badly wrong. So what we built and what we passionately believe in is democratizing access to legal services.
Because as you say, everyone is a creator, and it's certainly the rise of Substack, by the way, is exponential. And I particularly love it because it is long form and people can express themselves outside of social media in the way that we've kind of known. But everyone should be cognizant of this potential issue.
Yeah, in my former law firm, we would regularly be asked by self-publishing writers, for example, and don't forget, things move so quickly that we weren't asked by too many Substack people, although one or two came through. But a lot of the time they would say, hello, I've written a memoir. Could you please, and they'd be aware that, hang on, there are legal risks. Could you please review it? Now, I always did a deal with them because I believe in the writers' union. You've got to help other writers. And I would quite often legal the books myself, and I'd do them at a discounted rate. But most of the time, a writer in that category can't afford lawyers because you go to a standard West End media law firm now and you say, James, you've written your memoir, your account of X, Y, and Z in your life up to this date. There are a few tricky issues, 100,000 words. You're going to pay $5,000 to get that legaled. But what we've built is something where it will be a fraction of that cost.
What an incredibly powerful device and platform and tool. And I just adore the fact that it's not just the preserve of the few, the fact that it actually should be something that so many of us should take a look at. If nothing else, to educate us, because I think we've all become so incredibly too at ease with the notion of publishing. And I encourage it to young people all the time. I'm like, just go and do, make, put it out there, create. I never counsel back with, but just be careful what you write or be careful what you say. And maybe it's because, as you say, historically that journey is a tricky one and an expensive one, and it's one that also comes with language that is quite difficult to even understand for so many of us, that legal jargon world. Yeah. I love the fact that for many millions now this might be made an awful lot easier.
Well, we're hoping so. We really are. And again, the whole plain English approach as well is very important. No one wants to read a lawyer's report full of all that legalese that you have to have a law degree to even interpret. You know? So we're making it as simple and user-friendly as possible. But what I hope we can do, what I envisage, is we'll have some kind of clear draft community of self-publishing writers, for example. I don't know if it's going to be an app or how it's going to look, but for a very low cost, you could run a manuscript you're working on through ClearDraft. It comes out the other side in under 3 minutes, is how quickly we can legal a book at the moment. And
3 minutes to legal a book.
And then you've got your guide. You've got and then you've got access to, well, call one of us up if you do need further legal advice. The weird thing is, James, even a book like The Secret Life of Labradors can cause a legal problem. I don't know if this anecdote
what
comes
could anyone
from.
could possibly say wrong about a beautiful Labrador?
I'll give you one quick.
by the way, I grew up with labs. I'm a big
listen,
lab
I
fan.
love them as well.
My
I really
parents
do.
have got a lab. It's
Yeah.
more like a crazed horse.
I don't want to defame Labradors as a class of dog.
Please don't.
Because they're beyond reproach. In my view.
Absolutely.
We agree on that completely. Now, let's just imagine a book called The Secret Life of Labradors, and it's gone through a publishing house because no one thinks there could possibly be any legal issue whatsoever, right? But just suppose that in a chapter, and it's written by you, James, and you recount how you were on some private land where there were some red squirrels frolicking around, and your Labrador just acted as dogs do, chased one and actually caught it and killed it. And you just wrote that in a sort of very frank, jaunty fashion, et cetera, et cetera. Supposing there was some lurking innuendo meaning that the owners of that land on which red squirrels, a protected species, frolic around, had been negligent because they didn't sufficiently protect them. Well, supposing you weren't writing about your Labrador but someone else's Labrador, you could have a defamatory meaning that means that our Secret Lives of Labradors book suddenly got a very tricky legal issue.
Oh my gosh.
I'm not a doomsday merchant. I say again, 9 times out of 10, everybody's totally fine.
But what I love about the technology as you've described it is it's not just redlining. It's immediate. I think you described it as immediately articulating the defence of the case or the suggestive tweaks or editorial shifts that you should make in order, frankly, to make it work, right?
Yeah.
Now that's wonderful. So you've got solution in the moment within seconds.
Absolutely, yeah. But I think I really do want to emphasise that David, my co-CEO, and I, we both come at it from a point of view of we're pragmatic, because I don't want anybody to go out there being terrified, oh my God, I can't publish anything. Because as I say, most of the time you're fine. It's just when it goes wrong, it goes badly, badly wrong. Now, we demoed it to one of many national newspapers, one particular individual called the night editor over. She took one look at it and said, this is an amazing training tool. I could make all my young journalists just use this just to get their heads around legal issues.
It's really interesting. And the notion, or rather the role of a human still, like the chef at the pass, but that notion of judgment and the final decision, that's still key, right? It still needs to extract what is worth using, retaining, keeping, and going with it. Nothing can ever be entirely automated, right? These things need to live amongst other systems within those industries with great people like you just mentioned.
I think that, as a business, ClearDraft has various permutations. So I could see that if we create our ClearDraft community and we're looking to help self-publishing writers, we might make that available as it's not actual formal legal advice. Here is a guide to all the issues.
Got it.
But you can then contact one of us, and then you get that lawyer input. The human is still in the loop. I think as I say, there are different tiers in ways in which we'll work. But if we're working with, for example, a major multinational publisher, we probably look to have our lawyers fundamentally involved and/or their lawyers. So yes, to your point, lawyers are in the loop very much.
This is quite the journey. Are you happy now doing this? You seem to be glowing in the way you're describing something, perhaps in the same way as when we were talking about why we were both first attracted to something like boxing. Is this the happiest you've been?
I do feel very, very happy. I have to say, listen, I'm not complacent. I'm not that kind of person whatsoever. But what we've built is really exciting. And I'm loving every minute of every day. Something else happens and changes and moves forward. And that's really exciting. If I'd been the young surfer Alex, traveling the world surfing waves, and I'd heard some corporate guy say, yeah, I'm really excited about my new corporate venture, I'd have thought, you saddo, But of course, life is full circle. And why not be excited by something like this, which is really profoundly quite important, I think. And also, I have thoroughly enjoyed my zigzag life. It's been all over the shop. It's had some real lows, all of my own making. I like to think that it makes you more empathetic and able to help people because you yourself know what it's like to be in a pretty dark place.
Will there be any plurality left? Will there be any side hustles?
I will always want to write, and I've got another novel underway at the moment. It's a comic novel. I love comedy as a form.
Nice.
I have no time to write it whatsoever, but I'll get to it one of these days.
Alex Wade, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, James.
StoryCo is presented by me, James Kirkham. It's sponsored by TYX Studios in London, with special thanks to Jack Freegard, Panos Agamemnos, Craig Hepston-Stall and Tyler Newton. It's produced by Jago Lee, production managed by Archan Mohile, and was developed by Issa Gibson. Our theme music is by Doubt Point. It's a Telltale Industries production.